So, well, look, dear colleagues from Eliva, it's a pleasure for me to be able to give this training today in the context of the ASCLEPIUS project, our twinning project with not only Eliva, but obviously INRAE and University of Mino and my consultancy firm, Intelligentsia Consultants. So, as I was mentioning a short time ago, this presentation today is Module 1 with the title overview of EU project management. I'll be presenting for a bit over an hour and talking at a relatively high level, abstract level about EU project management. However, when I do Module 2, which is in late March, the 28th of March, and when I do Module 3 on the 25th of April, these training presentations will be very, very specific to Horizon Europe. And they'll be very sort of practical. I'll be giving, for example, in Module 2, a lot of examples of ways and means to write proposals for Horizon Europe. And I'll be drawing upon a lot of my own past experience. I'll be giving you lots of advice about bits of text, tables, figures that you can use in different sections of the Horizon Europe proposal application process. Similarly, Module 3, this will be really talking about the sort of execution, implementation of Horizon Europe projects. And again, I'll be drawing upon a lot of my own personal experience and practical examples of how you can go about on a practical day-to-day basis with managing an Horizon Europe project. Okay, so but about today. So look, today's agenda with my slides, I'm going to sort of cover the following. So it'll start with the basics of EU research funding schemes. When I say basics, it'll be a very, very quick step through a number of different EU funding schemes. I'll then move on to talk about project lifecycle overview. And in this essence, what I'm saying is that with EU projects, but also with any kind of projects, you can divide them into phases. You can consider an initiation phase, a planning phase, execution phase / control phase, and a closing phase. And with my slides, I'll be sort of illustrating those with a kind of case study of perhaps what a Horizon Europe project dealing with research and bacteriophages, how that might look like in these different phases. And I'll be finishing off by very briefly talking about different project management methodologies. And last but no means least, because projects is so much about just so reliant, of course, on the teams, the people involved and their responsibilities, I do a sort of kind of brief recap about what those roles and responsibilities typically look like. And then for those of you who want to, I've had a slide with a homework question. It's not obligatory, but for those of you who like to sort of practice things, it's a chance to do a bit of homework. So anyway, basics of EU research funding schemes. So for those of you who don't know, this figure that you see here on the right, this is a high-level view of the Horizon Europe program. So Horizon Europe, it's the EU's main funding program for research and development. It's a program that started in 2021 and runs to 2027. Has a massive budget, 95.5 billion euros. And this, in essence, this current program, it's the 9th in the series. So the very first, what was then called framework program for research, I believe it was launched in 1984. And each time they've been about 7 years in duration. And yes, this current one is called Horizon Europe, but if it was in the numbering terminology, it would be Framework Program 9. Now, each time there's a new program, there's a slightly different structure. With Horizon Europe, what you'll see in this figure is that we have these three main pillars. Pillar 1, excellent science. Pillar 2, global challenges. Pillar 3, innovative Europe. And then running at the bottom, sort of horizontally, you'll see this, this indicated widening participation and strengthening the European research area. So I'm not going to talk in great detail about these different programs because that will come in a later training, but except to say, from what I know about Eleva Institute, the obvious areas where I can see that you have opportunities to try to get funding, they would be, for example, under Pillar 1, you have the Maria Skłodowska-Curie actions. So one of the things that gets funded there is doctoral networks. I think that would be something potentially very interesting for Eleva to try to apply to, perhaps with the partners involved in ASCLEPIUS. Under Pillar 2, these global challenges, the one at the top, health, is the obvious one. And in fact, we've recently seen in a draft work program that there's a very interesting call relating to bacteriophages. Moving over to Pillar 3, where it says European Innovation Council, there's a scheme there called Pathfinder Open, which incidentally, I believe Eleva Institute was involved in a project in that area under the previous framework program, which was called Horizon 2020. And then, of course, with it at the bottom where it says widening, well, this in fact is the area of the program through which ASCLEPIUS is being funded. So very, very briefly, you can see across all areas, there's potentially opportunities for your institute to get involved and get funding. So moving on, as I said, it's a quick sort of step through on different funding programs. Another one which the EU is very famous for is Erasmus+. And like with Horizon Europe, it runs for a 7-year period from 2021 to 2027. It's divided up into these key actions. Certainly, and if you look under key action 1, I just highlight it, it mentions student mobility. So for many, many undergraduate students in the EU, they'll have heard of Erasmus because many of them would have done, say, a semester spent at another university in another part of Europe. And this sort of exchange, this mobility that they would have done, would have been funded through Erasmus. Another sort of area of funding, European Fund for Regional Development. So this is also a massive, massive program. It covers many different areas of funding, but amongst those you see things like investment in growth. That's sometimes the area where you maybe have opportunities dealing with research. With this sort of scheme, often the regional programs are sort of focused on involving countries which border with each other, sort of regions. And these are then sort of divided up into these areas: Interreg A, Interreg B, Interreg C, Interreg D. These programs also, I believe, sort of operate on a sort of 7-yearly basis. Now, it's a very quick sort of step through at a very high level there about different EU funding schemes. There are many, many more out there. What I would suggest, if you're interested, a few years ago, there was this guide published, EU, and you see on the right-hand side of the screen a sort of part of the cover, EU Learning, EU Funding Opportunities 2021 to 2027. The QR code in the top left-hand corner and the web link here, this will take you directly to the PDF. Now this, if you download it, this is a massive guide. It's like several hundred pages, but it seems to be pretty exhaustive on different funding schemes that exist. And what I would suggest is, yes, download it and maybe do a keyword search on terms that may be of interest to yourself. So moving away from sort of some examples of large EU funding schemes. The obvious sort of question, and in a way the obvious sort of answer, why is project management so important for in the context of EU projects? Well, there are many reasons, but on this slide I've sort of highlighted at least 5 of the potential reasons. So first and foremost, it's important from making sure that you fully utilize the funds that you get. So yeah, efficient project management will ensure that the funding obtained from the EU schemes is used effectively and responsibly, and that it aligns with the proposed budget and reduces wastage of resources. It's important from the point of view of compliance. So project management helps to ensure in compliance with the rules and regulations set by the EU for these funding schemes. It's important for time management. So proper project management allows for better time management, ensuring that research activities and milestones are completed within the given timelines. It's important for risk management. It helps in identifying, assessing, and managing potential risks that may affect the research project's progress or outcomes, thus reducing the likelihood of failure. And last but by no means least, quality control. So project management practices can help ensure that the research meets the required quality standards and delivers valuable and valid results. So stepping now to talk about project lifecycle. So I showed in the agenda these different phases, and I put them together in this very, very sort of simple arrow figure that you see here. So, I mean, the general idea is that time is running from, say, left to right at the bottom, and these are the phases. So we have, yes, initiation phase, planning phase. During the implementation in parallel, you're doing execution and control, and then you have this closing phase. And well, it might seem a rather pedantic point I'm going to make now, but when you step from these one phase to the other, so for example, from initiation to planning, instead of it being like a sort of straight line, and from one day to the next, you step from one phase to the other, I've kind of got these sort of hatched arrows. And in a simplistic way, what I'm trying to get across is, look, these phases, they overlap with each other. There's a kind of gray area that when you're finishing sort of one phase, at the same time, you're normally starting the next phase. And this is especially true, say, with the initiation phase and planning phase. You'll see there's a lot of overlap in the types of activity. Similarly, when you get to, say, the end of the project and you're close to finishing the execution and starting the closing phase, there's lots of overlap there. So don't. I remember many years ago, in one of my first jobs, I used to work in the automotive industry, and we were developing products for cars, and we didn't use exactly this terminology, but we talked also about phases. And I remember getting quite sort of worried, uptight about thinking, oh, well, we can't start that next phase 2 because we haven't finished, this activity in phase 1. And it took a senior engineer to sort of take me aside and say, look, that's real life. It's messy. You're doing things in conjunction. So the same goes for, with this sort of when you're dealing with projects with the EU. So some more words about the different phases. So initiation phase. So this is a stage where the project idea is formalized. In the context of EU funding schemes, this often involves identifying a research question that aligns with the priorities of the specific scheme. About putting together a project team and creating an initial project plan, including objectives, potential impacts, and an overview of work packages. The planning phase involves detailing the steps required to achieve the project goals. In an EU research funding context, this phase is crucial to prepare a detailed proposal for submission. And I would add to that, look, in essence, the planning phase is very much about writing the proposal, because in the proposal, there's so much, it's basically a plan of action. It captures so much information about how you'll go about doing the project if you win it. The execution and control phase. So once funding is secured, the project enters the concurrent execution and control phases, which involve carrying out the research activities as planned and controlling them. This includes regular reporting to the EU funding body as per the scheme's requirements. And then in the closing phase, this involves finalizing all activities, completing the documentation, and disseminating the results. In the context of EU-funded research, this often requires a final management report or evaluation to the funding body, demonstrating the achievements and impact of the project. So we're now going to sort of step through these phases and talk about them in more detail. And to try to make it a bit less abstract, I've come up with a very sort of simple case study, which incidentally, Natia and Elizabeth, I took the title of this forthcoming call for proposals in the health work program. And I try to create a very simple case study that runs through now through the rest of the slides as I'm talking about these different phases. So, so anyway, initiation phase. What are we thinking about this? So we need to define the project's goals and consider their feasibility. Now, if we were thinking about a project dealing with research concerning bacteriophages, defining the research question. So I'm not saying it would definitely be these things, but these are the sorts of points that we might want to consider. So in defining the research question, we probably need to identify some key bacterial infections where phage therapy shows promise. We probably need to determine specific antibiotic-resistant strains that will be targeted. We need to define probably some measurable safety and efficacy outcomes. We need to, usually in the call text, for certain in the call text, there'll be some information about what are the EU priorities, or if they're not, we need to go away and look for them. In the context of bacteriophages, the sort of priorities you probably need to think about would be how this project will contribute to the EU's antimicrobial resistance action plan. There's a thing called One Health, funded by the EU. We need to think about how our project might support that. And more generally, we need to sort of look up, what does the EU say about advanced, sustainable, and innovative medical solutions? Maybe we can find a way to align our project with those. We're going to need to think about assessing the technical feasibility for our projects. We need to sort of evaluate the phage selection, production, and administration methods. We need to identify challenges in phage stability, host range, and resistance development. Yes, we need to ensure compliance with the EU regulatory frameworks. So we kind of need to think about these issues as we're starting to put this proposal together. Is this technically feasible, what we want to do? And then from a sort of economic feasibility standpoint, from looking at the call text, seeing what the budget is available, can we, in terms of feasibility, we need to sort of estimate what the R&D clinical trials and production costs will be. Will there be sufficient budget for what we want to do? But then also thinking sort of externally for what we're hoping to develop. Is there a potential market demand? And overall, with this approach of bacteriophages, will it prove cost effective when we compare it to antibiotics? So these are all kinds of goals, objectives, and feasibility issues that we should be thinking about. Then another very key sort of thing we need to think about in this initiation phase is about the different stakeholders that this project will involve and what their interests will be. So this slide with all these points, this is not necessarily exhaustive, but these are certainly, if we're thinking about these different stakeholders, we're probably on a good path. So stakeholders, there'll be obviously the project team members, there'll be researchers, scientists, technical staff. Their interests will normally be sort of in the successful completion of the project. They want to advance their careers and contribute in some shape or form to the field of study. Other stakeholders in our consortium, there'll probably be other academic research institutions. They might be interested in helping to conduct the clinical trials and safety efficacy studies. They'll want to advance their scientific knowledge on phage therapy. They'll be interested in publishing findings and contributing to policy recommendations. We then have healthcare providers and medical professionals. So they'll be interested in accessing alternative treatments for antibiotic-resistant infections, ensuring patient safety and clinical effectiveness, and the potential to integrate phage therapy into their own treatment protocols. We then have, say, pharmaceutical and biotech companies. Moving on, we should be thinking about EU regulatory bodies, for example, the EMA, national agencies. They're keen to evaluate the safety, efficacy, and compliance with EU regulations. They might be interested in providing guidance on clinical design, trial design, and approval processes. And they'll be interested in supporting the alignment with AMR policies and One Health strategy. Policymakers and public health authorities is another stakeholder. So they'll be most probably interested in implementing strategies to combat AMR, interested in supporting funding and policy incentives for innovative therapies, and the monitoring of public health impacts and long-term sustainability. And then last but certainly by no means least, patient advocacy groups and the public are stakeholders that we need to think about. So their interests are likely to lie in ensuring accessibility and affordability of new treatments, promoting patient-centered approaches to clinical research, and about raising awareness regarding antibiotic resistance and alternative therapies. So we now sort of move on to talk a bit more about, if you like, things that there's sort of objectives we need to define, feasibility, stakeholders. Let's imagine we're now at the stage where we're trying to get an idea off the ground. We're trying to get a consortium together. If you're at that stage, one of the things that you may want to do, which would be a good idea, is to come up with, and this is assuming that you yourself or your organization is an initiator for this proposal idea. But if that's the case, it's good to come up with what's called a project charter, or also referred to as a project abstract. So this will be like a document of maybe 1 to 2 pages. And this is something that you can send to your potential consortium partners to try to get their interest, to try to outline what this proposal idea is about. Now, assuming you're doing this, and in the lower half of the page, you start to see this case study. So to try to illustrate what I mean about a project charter. So with this case study, I'm trying to make it say as real as possible. It says there, Horizon Europe call for proposals for testing safety and efficacy of phage therapy for the treatment of antibiotic resistance bacterial infections. For those of you who don't know, this is actually a call that is going to be in the health work program under Horizon Europe. I can't remember the exact deadline. I believe it's sometime in the autumn, but the Commission is looking to fund something like 3 projects, each for 15 million euros. So it's a big project which will probably involve large consortia. So let's imagine we're trying to do a project charter for because we're trying to stimulate and create a proposal for that call. So look, in this project charter, I would expect to see our proposed project title, our proposed project objectives, key stakeholders, expected deliverables, and preliminary timing. So yeah, look, our project title, it's very, very similar to, in fact, the title of the call for proposals. Our project objectives, I haven't specified any numbers here, but it's likely to touch upon the following: evaluation of clinical safety and efficacy of phage therapy, because of course that's what's in the call. It should address antimicrobial resistance challenges. We're looking to develop guidelines for regulatory approval and clinical use. Who are the key stakeholders? I won't through those because we already kind of covered that in the previous slide, but it's sort of the obvious ones from our previous slide. Expected deliverables. These are just defined very generally at this stage, but the deliverables in the project will almost certainly be things like clinical trial results showing the safety and efficacy, some regulatory pathway recommendations, a scalable phage therapy production framework, scientific publications and policy briefs. And what might be a preliminary timeline? This is not detailed at all. Well, we think it might be over something like 5 years. And broadly speaking, this is what we would expect to go on in years 1 to 2, 3 to 4, and year 5. So that's how a project abstract, a project charter might look like in this context. But if we move on and also in this initiation phase, start to think somewhat more in detail about the project team. So our initial project team, this involves us identifying key roles, responsibilities, and the skills that will be required, not only for ourselves, but across, of course, our consortium partners. Well, with our case study for this Horizon Europe call, we probably want to be thinking about the following kinds of experts. Clearly, we will need a principal investigator. This person will lead the scientific direction, ensure research integrity. They'll oversee the clinical trial design and execution. We'll need researchers and clinicians who'll conduct laboratory and clinical studies, analyze data, and so forth. We're talking about EU project management, so we'll certainly need a project manager who will coordinate project activities and milestones and ensure compliance with Horizon Europe guidelines. We'll need regulatory and ethics experts. We'll need a dissemination communication manager, someone who will develop outreach strategy for stakeholders and publish findings and manage public engagement. We should think about industry and biotech partners who can support the phage production and commercialization and facilitate tech transfer and scalability. And we should be thinking probably about patient advocacy representative to ensure patient-centered approach and accessibility. In the initiation phase, we should also be thinking about what our requirements are in terms of initial resources. So this is not only about, say, the funding, but also other resources like personnel, equipment, facilities. And if we think in the context of our case study, these are the sort of things, it's not an exhaustive list, but if we think about these things, we're probably covering the most important resource issues that we should think about at this stage. So, of course, there's the funding and budget. We're applying for a Horizon Europe grant for the R&D, clinical trials and dissemination, but maybe there's opportunity to get some sort of co-funding from the industry and biotech partners. Maybe the provision of their laboratories or facilities can be funded by themselves. Personnel, we've talked at length about different people required for the team on the previous slide. Moving on and thinking about clinical laboratory facilities. So we're going to need to make sure that across our consortium, we've got partners that can provide biosafety approved labs for phage production and testing. We're going to need some hospital partnerships for patient recruitment and trials. But still in this area of equipment, we're going to be dealing a lot with data. So we should be thinking about the technological and data infrastructure. We're going to need to have access to bioinformatic tools for phage characterization and resistance tracking. We need to have a secure data management system for clinical and regulatory reporting. And then also in the area of resources, stakeholder and public engagement, we've already spoken about patient advocacy groups, industry partners, and we also should be thinking about the communication strategy for EU policy alignment and dissemination. So we already mentioned in our project charter some words about project deliverables, but it was at a rather very early preliminary stage. A bit later within the initiation phase, we should be starting to sort of flesh out what these deliverables are. Now, just to remind ourselves, deliverables are sort of some sort of tangible proof of the project's progress and outcomes. They're very important for accountability to the EU funding body and for communicating with our stakeholders and disseminating the results to the wider community. Again, in the context of our case study for this Horizon Europe call, let's sort of flesh out what these deliverables might be. So clearly there's clinical trial results. There'll be safety and efficacy data from the phase 1 and phase 2 trials, patient outcomes and response to patient therapy. This needs to be all captured and reported in a deliverable or deliverables. Regulatory pathway recommendations, so compliance guidelines for EMA approval, ethical and legal framework for clinical application. These will need to be captured in reports that will be submitted as deliverables. A scalable phage therapy production framework, so standardized phage manufacturing, quality control processes, industrial scalability assessment for market adoption. These will need to be reported. Scientific publications and policy briefs, so certainly academic partners will be sort of publishing their results in hopefully in high impact journal articles. These will need to be reported to the Commission. Also some policy briefs for EU decision makers and healthcare stakeholders. Public and stakeholder engagement reports. There should be some reporting done, capturing the deliverable for the Commission there. And then, say, lastly, tech transfer and commercialization plan. So these EU projects, they fund usually the sort of rather early stages of research. There's not typically funding that will take you all the way to commercialization. So what is important in your grant proposal, and to already think about this initiation stage, is to think, well, after this project's over, what's the plan, or what could be a plan for our industrial partners to commercialize this, to take this further. So during the course of your project, certainly at the end, you'll have a deliverable report where you sort of capture this tech transfer commercialization plan. And then, say, lastly, in this initiation phase, it's important to think about possible challenges, i.e. risks, and to develop mitigation strategies, approaches to counteract those. So if we drop down to our case study for the Horizon Europe call, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are certainly the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about. So during the course of a project, we may encounter regulatory and ethical approval delays. So the risk is that these requirements are so complex that getting approval takes a long time. What could be the mitigation measure? Well, early engagement with EMA and ethics boards, adaptive trial design might be an approach. Another risk we are likely to face is phage stability and efficacy variability. So the risk is phage resistance or instability in different environments. What could be a mitigation measure? Well, we could implement robust screening, formulation optimization, and combination therapy strategies. There are challenges probably relating to clinical trial recruitment and patient response. So the risk is that we have a limited patient pool and variable individual responses. What could be a mitigation measure that we capture? Well, it could be, for example, having multi-center trials for diverse recruitment. Adaptive dosing strategies might be another. And then on the sort of manufacturing scalability side, there are challenges. There could be challenges in getting to large-scale phase production and ensuring quality control. What might be the mitigation measure? Well, hopefully through the collaboration with the biotech partners for GM-compliant production. So look, these are all important issues, things to consider about in this sort of initiation phase. Let's assume now that and there's been enough interest created within the consortium in this initiation phase that they really want to go ahead and do this proposal. So now they're in this sort of planning phase. They're in this stage of writing the proposal. Let's talk about the sort of issues, the things that should be thought about there. So in this planning phase, no surprises. We need to come up with a detailed project plan. This plan serves as a roadmap for the project. It outlines the activities to be performed, the resources required, and the timeline for completion. In the context of this Horizon Europe call that we have in the latest health work program, what may we be thinking about for this project plan? So we need to come up with a work breakdown structure. In other words, work packages. We need to divide all these work activities into these groups of tasks, these work packages. What might they look like? I mean, this is just an example. I don't insist upon it, but work packages might be these 5 that we have here. So work package 1 might be the preclinical research and phase optimization. Work package 2 might be clinical trials phase 1 and 2. Work 3 about manufacturing and scalability. And then, as with all EU-funded projects, there's a work package sort of devoted to dissemination, communication, promotion, although in this case, because policy recommendations are so important, that they also feature in that work package. And then the last work package 5, is about the project coordination. And again, specific to this topic we're dealing here, the work on regulatory compliance, that would perhaps fit best here, or possibly again in the work package 4. Resource allocation. So we need to start planning this in more detail. This means we need to think about defining the dedicated research teams for lab and clinical studies. We need to think in detail about the biotech industry partners for production scalability, and about the tasks and experts in regulation for compliance and approval. In this project plan, we need to flesh out, give more details about the timing, so the dates of the work packages. So thinking about these 4 or 5 work packages, well, look, in years 1 to 2, we'll probably be focused more on sort of the work package 1, years 2 to 4, the clinical trials work package 2, years 3 to 5, the manufacturing scale up and dissemination, so the work packages 3, work packages 4. And then milestones, which are sort of key dates demonstrating the progress of the project. It's important to have milestones spread across the duration of the project, not only at the very end. So there may be a milestone at month 12 at the end of year 1. Hopefully the preclinical results and regulatory approvals have been achieved. Maybe by month 24, the phase 1 clinical trial will be completed. Month 36, phase 2 trial data analysis. Month 48, scalable production framework finalized. And by month 60, the end of the 5 years, policy briefs and commercialization roadmap. In this planning phase, We're going to need to set up in more detail the budget and scheduling plans. Again, looking at our case study. So for the budgeting plan, we're going to need to think about the different cost categories: personnel, clinical trials, lab equipment, regulatory compliance, dissemination. To name just sort of 5, there's probably some more categories to think about. Funding sources we've already spoken about. Cost estimation. So increasingly with EU Horizon Europe funded projects, we're moving to what's called lump sum funding. And basically this means is that you have to calculate the budget for each and every work package. So this is something that we'll need to do in this planning phase, and we'll need to capture in the proposal. When we're doing this budgeting, we should have some kind of risk buffer. So there should be some kind of contingency funding. But being honest with you, it's not like you have a cost category which you call contingency. It's something that you just have to sort of automatically build into or include into the other cost categories. So if for example, for simplicity's sake, you thought I need 100,000 euros for personnel costs, and you've got contingency of 10%, so then you're going to basically bump up your personnel cost to 110,000, and so on and so forth. Scheduling plan, we kind of talked about this already in some of the earlier slides, but this is, in essence, it's just saying that we need to sort of flesh out more and more in detail across the work packages. Last thing perhaps to mention the planning phase is about the defining of quality metrics and objectives, or rather quality metrics in the context of objectives. So defining quality metrics and objectives during the planning phase of EU-funded research projects is vital to ensure the project meets the expected standards and achieves its goals. Quality metrics and objectives provide a clear definition of what constitutes success for the project. They provide a standard against which project performance can be measured and evaluated, which is essential for accountability to the funding body. Thinking again of our case study, quality metrics, usually you hear people talk about key performance indicators, KPIs. So what might they be for our Horizon Europe call? Well, there's different groupings we could probably identify. Firstly, scientific and clinical KPIs. So we might be trying to define a preclinical success rate, the percentage of phage candidates showing efficacy in lab models. We would probably be trying to sort of define a KPI for the clinical trial milestone. So completion of phase 1 by month 24, phase 2 by month 36. We would hopefully be also sort of trying to define some kind of KPI for patient outcomes, so reduction in bacterial load and infection recovery rates. Another sort of category of KPIs, regulatory and compliance. So we would be sort of saying we're hoping to secure ethical approval by month 12, and regulatory submissions, we're aiming to have them submitted by month 48. This is, in essence, is also a KPI. In terms of manufacturing and scalability KPIs, we might be thinking about production yields. We want to increase the phage batch consistency and quality. By the end of the project, we've reached a certain production yield. Similarly, cost efficiency, reduction in production cost per phage dose. We might be trying to specify this, a target that we aim to reach by the end of the project. And then thinking about other aspects of the project, about dissemination and impact. A classic one in all EU-funded projects is to specify a KPI for the number of scientific publications. We even have that KPI for ASCLEPIUS project. So that's some words about the planning phase. Let's imagine, come this autumn, you've submitted your proposal, and The commission typically allows something like, I think it's something like is it 4 to 5 months to evaluate these proposals. So let's imagine that let's dream that by perhaps early months of 2026, you're hearing the good news. Your proposal, the one that you're involved in, has been selected for funding. And now you're going to be implementing a project. So what would be the activities to sort of think about here? Well, no real surprises. You're going to need to deploy resources and start to execute this project plan. For this case study, if we think about personnel deployment, you're going to need to think about, well, the research teams that you're going to need sort of during years 1 to 2, who are going to conduct the preclinical studies, regulatory experts that secure approvals. So you're going to need to make sure that you're recruiting them if you don't already have them in your teams. Later on in the project, years 2 to 4, you're going to need to make sure you've got the clinicians and trial coordinators at hand to execute the phase 1 and 2 trials. So you need to think in advance of that. Do you have that expertise? Do they need to be recruited? And then years 3 to 5, the manufacturing experts, same story. Make sure that if you don't have them, that they're recruited sufficiently in time. Deployment of equipment. Year 1, you're going to need to make sure you've got this laboratory equipment set up for your phase screening and formulation. Years 2 to 3, the clinical trial sites need to be equipped for patient treatment and monitoring. Years 4 to 5, industrial scale production infrastructure needs to have been established for GMP compliance. And then if we think about facility utilization, according to the different stages in the project, you'll need to make sure that either the research labs, hospitals, biotech partners are in place in time for those. In this execution phase, so we talked about deployment of resources. Let's say some words about the management of teams and their tasks, and specific again to this case study. So you need to think about task allocation, performance monitoring, and conflict resolution. So with task allocation, the things you should be thinking about assigning clear roles based on expertise, use the work breakdown structure, the work packages to distribute the tasks to the different experts, and you need to implement some sort of task management system for tracking responsibilities. Performance monitoring. So you have these people working on these different tasks. It's good if you can do some sort of regular progress reviews, maybe on a monthly or weekly team meetings, tracking these key performance indicators that we mentioned in an earlier slide. How are we doing? How are we progressing towards those? Risk and issue tracking. We already talked about the initiation phase about identifying challenges, risks, and mitigation measures. So the list, the table that you have with these risks, it's good to review that regularly, perhaps update it because new risks get identified. On the subject of conflict resolution, so hopefully you're working with good partners, you're familiar with each other's, you've been working with them for many years, you get on well, but even with that said and done, there's still, with these complex projects, scope and opportunities that there may be some kind of conflict or misunderstandings. How to sort of deal with that? Well, the important thing is to have clear communication protocols. So to define a reporting structure and escalation procedures. The person is the project manager, she or he, they should be sort of dedicated or be prepared to sort of get involved in mediation if there are conflicts. And if even at this sort of stage, at the sort of level of the project manager, this conflict can't be resolved. It's important that within what's called your consortium agreements, you have some sort of procedure, protocol about decision making on a consensus basis, so that the relevant stakeholders can be engaged to resolve disagreements on a collaborative basis. So when you're executing the project, when you're implementing it, even with the best sort of proposal, the best plan in the world, it's seldom the case that a project runs completely smoothly. There's often, because the things you're dealing with are so complex, there's often things that at some point in some way or other, the project needs to be changed, or an aspect of it may need to be changed. And you usually can't make these changes sort of independently. You need to get some sort of formal approval. Now, if we're thinking about our case study for this Horizon Europe project, what might be the changes that occur or need to be formally approved during the running of the project? We can identify several different categories. So firstly, methodology changes. There may need to be updates to protocols and SOPs in line with regulatory requirements. There may need to be communication changes to research and clinical teams with training if needed. Facility changes. So it's important to evaluate facility upgrades for capacity and compliance, e.g. GMP standards. If this is the case, it's important to coordinate with lab and clinical site managers for seamless transition. With all EU projects, bacteriophage related or physics related or whatever, they often experience staffing changes. So if this occurs, it's important to identify if a staff member leaves, what's the skill gap? Can we cover that with the existing staff, or do we need to recruit some new specialized personnel for that? And if we are recruiting somebody new, it's important to do some sort of onboarding and training for the new team members. The other category of change, it's a classic one, is about schedule changes. So often simply the activities that we had planned, they don't run as smoothly, as quickly as we had foreseen, and we require extensions to the project. If you have such a situation, in order to get to justify and get approval from the European Commission, it will be vital to convince the Commission that if the project isn't extended, then there's a risk that one or more milestones won't be satisfactorily completed, and therefore the full impact of the project won't be achieved. If you can do this, then the Commission might allow a 6-month extension to the project. In parallel with the execution phase, it's important to do checks, to do controls. So what might that involve in practical terms? So clearly control is about tracking, reviewing and regulating project progress. We need to do this to make sure that you align with the project plan, that we detect any issues early, and that we take corrective action if necessary. With our case study, these are things that we might want to sort of consider. So we might want to have what's called a project dashboard. A project dashboard is something which is sort of visible to team members. I mean, in the past, again, when I was in the automotive sector, this is many years ago, in those, I was working in a company where we were several engineers sort of working closely together, but we would have like a visible poster table showing the KPIs that we were tracking and where we stood. And this This is a very visible, immediate way to have an understanding of our current status. Of course, now with these EU projects, we're dispersed teams spread across many countries. So this concept of project dashboard is not something physical, it'll be something virtual. Maybe you have it stored on some sort of database, online database, or alternatively, maybe the project manager, she or he is sort of distributing a regular email, which is sort of showing the progress. Now, in this dashboard, however you store it, it's good to sort of identify the progress on completion of work packages, milestones, KPIs. It can also be visual reports on the budget spent, resource allocation, and risks. Other things to track, clinical visits and monitoring. So the project manager, it's really good if they can get involved in some sort of regular site visits to ensure adherence to trial protocols, monitoring of patient monitoring checkpoints for safety and efficacy assessment, and also compliance with good clinical practice and regulatory standards. Another way we can do sort of tracking and review is to have status reports. So the project manager might request that the different consortium partners produce quarterly progress reports covering key achievements and challenges. Maybe every 6 months there's a consortium meeting or stakeholder meeting to review performance and make any necessary adjustments. And then with Horizon Euro projects, the Commission divides them up into different periods. If it's a 3-year project, typically you have 2 periods, period 1, period 2. Probably for this type of project on bacteriophages, I could well imagine if it's running for 5 years, you're probably going to have something like 3 different periods. Whatever, whether it's 2, 3, 4 periods. At the end of those periods, you have to do formal reporting. You have to issue periodic management reports. And this is, of course, another way in which to track and regulate project progress. Comparing actual performance with planned performance. So how can we do this in the context of our case study? There's timeline tracking. We can use Gantt charts. We can compare planned to actual progress and work packages. We can identify delays and bottlenecks. Budget comparison. Typically, realistically, this will only be done at the end of each of the different periods. That's when you usually have to require partners to complete financial statements or to sort of fill in online their lump sum funding documents. KPIs we've already spoken about. Obviously checking where you are compared to where you hope to be. And so at the end of this 5 years, hopefully on this, 4 to 5 years for this project, you're getting to the end, you're in the closing phase. What are the last sort of things to sort of think about in this context? So I've written here, deliver the final product or service. So to be honest, when I wrote this, I was thinking more generally about EU projects, which are, say, not only dealing with less so, say, dealing with bacteriophages and more sort of projects where it's sort of ICT, there's some kind of computer system or some kind of new sensor or so forth. I guess in the context of bacteriophages, it's a combination of those things, isn't it? Product and service that you've got at the very end. Anyway, what will they be? Well, what do we think they might be? Again, we can group into different categories. We can talk about clinical and scientific deliverables. Those are part of the final product service. We can think about the knowledge dissemination. In fact, we've got KPIs for many of these. We'd already identified KPIs for the high impact scientific publications and policy briefs. Public and industry engagement. We haven't spoken about this before, but in the context of such a project, it would probably be a good thing to have some sort of final conference or workshop where all the results are presented, and you can kind of sort of finish the project with a bit of a, well, with a bang, basically. But also part of the sort of final deliverables, these industry and biotech partnerships. We mentioned it before, but it's good to mention again. The projects, even if it's running for 5 years, it's unlikely to take to develop these this approach right to the point of commercialization. There'll probably need to be further steps, and it's very important that the industry and biotech partners, that they're producing some sort of report that describes in detail what will be the next stages beyond the project to achieve full exploitation. Also in this closing phase, so it's time to release various different project resources that have been tied up during the past 4 or 5 years. So for a case study, human resources, the things we might want to be thinking about are things like a sort of final performance review and knowledge transfer to future projects, reassignment or contract closure for temporary research staff, provision of acknowledgements and professional development support for team members. In the context of physical resources, maybe we need to think about decommissioning or repurposing lab equipment for future research, facility handover and compliance checks for safe project closure, data archiving and documentation for regulatory and academic use. And then on the financial resources side, you might need to be thinking about the sort of final budget reconciliation, financial audits for the Horizon Europe compliance, closure of grants and funding agreements with stakeholders, reporting of financial expenses to ensure transparency and accountability. And then lastly, I've written here, document lessons learned. I mean, if I'm really honest, I think this is not often done, but it is nevertheless, it is actually a very good thing to do. So what I'm suggesting here in this, right at the end of this closing phase, is that you do some sort of reflection on what went well, what went badly, what could be improved in the future. And in the context of our case study for this Horizon Europe project, maybe we can write some lessons learned under these different headings. So under scientific and clinical insights, we might want to reflect upon, the effectiveness of the phage therapy across antibiotic-resistant infections. We might want to reflect upon the challenges that we faced during the clinical trials and ways that they could be improved upon. It'd be good to sort of reflect and sort of capture what have been best practices for phage selection and formulation stability. Moving over to talk about financial resource efficiency, it's good perhaps to reflect upon how accurate our budgeting was versus actual costs. What did we underestimate the budget for personnel? Did we overestimate the funding required for equipment? Thinking about this, capturing this, feeding that into the next proposal that we do, so that we optimize the resources used. On the dissemination and impacts, it's good to do a sort of candid reflection on, how effective we've been with our outreach. Did we successfully, for example, manage to engage with policymakers? Has industry shown a strong interest in what we've done? Can we point to good engagement with the general public? And if not, what could be ways to improve upon that? The scientific publications, did we manage to publish in good high-impact journals? If not, what could be ways perhaps to improve that approach? And any future directions for phage therapy research and commercialization? some reflections on that and perhaps capturing that could all be beneficial for the next time we're doing proposal preparation and running projects. So that's quite a few words, quite a few slides talking about these different phases of the project lifecycle for EU projects, in particular for Horizon Europe, and this case study of this call for proposals relating to phages and phage therapy. I just want to show a few more slides, more general ones, not specific per se to EU projects. So some words about project management methodologies. So that it's just one slide here. So there are different ways and means to manage projects. And on this slide, I'm just only highlighting three. It's really for those of you, what I would suggest is if there are some of you who are specifically interested about different approaches, I would suggest to sort of go away and do a bit of a search on the internet. But with that said, these are probably arguably the most common, certainly that you maybe hear in the context of EU managing EU projects. So the first one here says waterfall methodology. So this is a traditional project management methodology. It's considered linear and sequential. Each phase must be completed before the next one can begin, making it suitable for projects with clear, unchanging requirements and where tasks are dependent on each other, such as many research projects. Yeah, I said right at the start of the project, I was saying, look, these initiation phase, planning phases, they all overlap. That somewhat runs counter to what's being said here in the waterfall methodology. And yet I'd still say, I think, to be honest, despite that contradiction in what's said here and what I've said earlier on, I would say that in general, the waterfall methodology is probably the methodology that you will naturally adopt in the context of running a Horizon Europe project. There is this also method PRINCE2, projects and controlled environments. PRINCE2 is a process-based approach that provides a detailed roadmap for how the project should be managed and executed. It's widely used in the UK government and in many sectors and countries worldwide. And I would add to that, there are quite a number of organizations that provide training and you can get professional certification in this particular type of methodology. So if you were to say, you did a Google search on PRINCE2 professional certification, you'll probably get quite a number of hits. So, and certainly this PRINCE2 is very relevant for EU projects. So if you want to go down that route, I mean, try also looking under, say, waterfall methodology, professional certification. I'm not so sure you'd find so many hits. It's probably the PRINCE2 that you would need to look at. This third one, agile methodology, I mention it here. This method is iterative and flexible, allowing for regular adjustments throughout the project. Although it's widely used in software development, it can also be applied to research projects, especially those involving complex tasks, rapid changes, or a high level of uncertainty. I'm not sure if this agile methodology is something that you can apply to the entirety of a Horizon Europe project, but quite possibly it's a good approach for, say, specific scientific tasks, maybe where it's rather complicated and you need to be reactive, you need to be very creative in coming up with new processes, new ways to try to resolve issues. So that's just a few words about different methodologies. My last slide, in essence, I'm repeating what has already been said much earlier in the presentation about project teams, but The implementation of projects is so reliant, of course, on people. It's worthwhile, almost as a sort of epitaph, as a last word, to sort of remind ourselves, look, if you're going to go ahead and do some sort of research proposal for Horizon Europe, if you're going to have a project in that area, these are the kinds of key roles, the key people you're going to need. Now, project manager, principal investigator, we already mentioned those. In fact, one role, which we hadn't mentioned earlier on, project administrator, which is very important. This is the person who helps to handle administrative tasks such as financial management, reporting, compliance with EU funding requirements. I mean, frankly speaking, this is a kind of role that I'm often, if not taking on fully myself, certainly providing support in that area. Sadly, because of the bureaucracy around these projects, it's a very necessary role. Research associates, assistants, we've spoken about. Stakeholder representatives, we talked about. Dissemination communication officer, we have spoken about. But just to repeat, the European Commission, they place a really strong importance on dissemination and communication. So and outreach, and they have this thing called the Open Science Policy, which is all about this sort of communication in all its different forms. So when you're putting together these proposals, don't be afraid at all to be identifying and allocating a person to be the dissemination and communication officer. So look, that's been rather a lot of slides, a lot of words about sort of giving an overview of EU project management and about the project life cycle. With this very, very last slide here, it's about some homework. Now, it's not obligatory, you don't have to do this, but speaking from my own personal learning approach, I find seeing a presentation, it's a rather passive kind of activity. And to be honest, if I haven't already fallen asleep after 15-20 minutes during most presentations, even if I haven't, 1 or 2 days later, I've probably forgotten quite a lot of the content of the slides of a presentation. It's only by doing something kind of active that I have a better retention, better memory of what was presented. And so basically what I'm alluding to is that, doing some homework, doing some work where you actually get a chance to try out these things, then it somehow becomes better ingrained in certainly in my memory. So what I'm saying is, for those of you who want to, here's some homework. It's not too arduous, it's not too difficult. Basically, what I would like you to do is to outline the initiation phase for your own case study. So this case study can be on any topic of science and technology. I suspect you probably also want to do it on bacteriophages, maybe on a more specific, narrower application area or topic, whatever. It's for you to choose the topic that you feel is most relevant to you. What I would like to see is, I'd like you to sort of describe the issues, the sort of issues that you would consider in the initiation phase. In a similar way it was done for the case study on testing safety and efficacy of phage therapy for the treatment antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections. So over several pages of A4, it'd be really nice if you could say capture the project charter, some information about the initial project team, initial resources, project deliverables, outline for preliminary timeline, and maybe a table, maybe some words of what might be the challenges, the risks, and mitigation measures. If you do the homework, please send it to me at the following email address, and please send it to me the latest by the 14th of March. If you do that, I will review what you send me, and I'll do my best within a few days to sort of get back to you with some sort of critical feedback on what you've produced.